Okay, good evening to all of our participants, guests, and also to our speakers. So we have three speakers today for all of us. We have Professor Jarrod Shanahan, Miss Alexandra, and Miss Chloe Tan joining us to speak more about racism on a global scale. So I would really like to thank them to join us especially on a Friday morning from all the way from America. So just want to thank you for joining us, speakers. So just to go and to help everyone understand the process of this session, this breakdown will start off where we introduce the speakers and they will give us an opening statement on their own topics of discussion. Following the speakers' introduction and their statements, we'll move on to the question and answers session where audience are welcome to add in questions in the Zoom chat, or they're welcome to unmute. They'll be unmuted and they can voice out their questions to the speakers themselves. So following that, we'll move into the solution session, which it ties into the question and answer. So during this round, any solutions or understanding possible solutions and whether they are impactful or working in different societies will be talked about, and after which we'll try to close. So we're trying to stick to 30 minutes of 1 hour session. So let's hope that we can keep to that. So I think first of all, we'll have our first speaker. So joining me is my other moderator, so Jordan. So Jordan will be introducing our first speaker for all of us to hear. So Jordan, please.
Thank you, Sarah. So together with us today, we actually have Prof. Shanahan. So Prof. Shanahan is an assistant professor of criminal justice in GSU College of Arts and Sciences. So he is also an expert on the history of the New York City jail system and a critical scholar of policing and incarceration in United States. So in addition to criminal justice, Prof. Shanahan's areas of interest also include jails, prisons, policing, Rikers Island, labor organizing, New York City history, pop culture, and social movement. He's a very active speaker and presenter at various conferences. So let us together welcome Prof. Shanahan with us today. Hi, Prof.
Thank you very much.
So will you yeah.
How's it going? So this evening, I would like to discuss a particular orientation toward understanding race and anti-racism that doesn't look at race as the product of bad ideas that can be addressed in the classroom or the corporate boardroom, but instead treats race and racism as concrete historical products that have a real material history, haven't always existed, and therefore can come to an end through collective actions undertaken by people of all so-called races working in concert. So given the recent epidemic of anti-Asian racism in the United States, I'd like to look at the historical origins of this phenomenon. Most importantly, before we begin, you must know that Europeans coming to the United States in the 18th and 19th century would not have considered themselves white before arriving on American soil. They would have thought of themselves as members of a particular religion, nation, political affiliation, or even from a very particular region of their homeland. The idea that all workers of European descent share a common racial heritage did not always exist. Asian Americans, especially the Chinese, were brought to the United States in great numbers in the mid-19th century, mainly to work in the hothouse expansion of the US railroad system, a staggering infrastructure project that crisscrossed the United States, blasting through mountains and other treacherous terrain so quickly that by 1873, it had caused a massive economic crisis by virtue of corporations having built too much track. Chinese workers were transported to the US by immigration agencies that charged predatory fees that put them deep in debt, which had also happened to many European workers. In the US, Chinese workers lacked the rights of citizens and found only the most dangerous and low-wage jobs available to pay off their debts. On the railroad, Chinese workers were paid considerably less than their white counterparts and used for the most dangerous work. They battled persistent skepticism that they were not skilled enough to do the high-end jobs reserved for European workers. This was, of course, not true. Not only were the Chinese as apt laborers as anyone, after all, I must emphasize, there are not different races of people, but many came to the US with necessary experience to do the jobs that were considered skilled. The animosity between Chinese workers and the workers of European descent, and even African descent, had a very simple origin. It wasn't superstition or fear of the unknown or ignorance. Railroad managers played Chinese Americans against European and African Americans in order to drive down wages, prevent workers from striking, and keep everyone working as hard as possible in extremely dangerous conditions. Workers were kept in separate groups based on nationality or so-called race, and encouraged to compete with each other for who could work the fastest. They were doing much of the same dangerous work, and they had a whole lot more in common with each other than they did with their bosses. But for the railroad to be profitable, the managers had to play the different groups against each other, especially to prevent the workers from forming unions. Originally, railroad managers believed that the Chinese would not go on strike and could be used to discourage European workers from demanding higher wages and safer conditions. Chinese workers were in fact used to break strikes, and the result was animosity that sometimes turned into open combat. Irish workers used explosives to attack Chinese work camps, and the Chinese responded by doing the same thing to Irish work camps. But soon enough, the Chinese workers were also sick of the low wages and dangerous conditions. They began to organize strikes. When they did this, the railroad managers threatened to bring in African American and even Japanese workers, who they claimed would work for lower wages and would tolerate unsafe conditions. Interestingly, Chinese workers were also called a terrible slur that is today associated with anti-Black racism. It was in the context of this labor market competition that European Americans banded together as a power bloc and began considering themselves white. And we also can't forget that this entire infrastructure project, driven by workers from all over the world, was the occasion for aggressive violence and displacement of indigenous people, who the railroad managers policed in part through the use of African American so-called Buffalo Soldiers. Projects like the 19th century railroads, so formative of the physical infrastructure in the United States, are also the origins of the racial animosity that we see in the US today. I hope this brief historical example demonstrates that racism, and even race itself, are not the product of bad ideas or ignorance, but come from how our society is organized. But this is not destiny. Last summer in the United States, people of all walks of life stood up to considerable police violence to defy the country's racial order that has split us up into warring factions for centuries for the benefit of a small ruling class. People took great risks together and began to undo the tears that race has made in the fabric of humanity. They demonstrated with concrete actions that racism and race itself have a history, and this means they can also be brought to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shanahan. So to inform us and help us understand more about the history of such racial violence and the origin of them. So moving on, we will be moving on to our next speaker. So our next speaker would be Miss Alexandra. So Miss Alexandra has been a police officer for the past 22 years. She has experience with and first-hand knowledge of the needs and concerns of citizens. So Ms. Alexandra is consistently disturbed at the amount of injustice and oppression she has observed while patrolling the most impoverished areas of Chicago's south suburbs, and hopes to ensure that the well-being of every citizen within her jurisdiction and provide safekeeping for the community. In her 22 years of service, she has dedicated herself to serve the citizens and to decrease racism and police mistreatment in the community, receiving commendations for heroic acts and police duty excellence. She holds a bachelor's degree in English and master's degree in criminal justice from GSU. Ms. Alexandra is 2 months shy of graduating with a PhD in community psychology at National Louis University, with special attention to uncovering systemic oppression in law enforcement. We now welcome her to share her statements and whatever topics she wishes to discuss with all of us. Ms. Alexandra, please.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. I appreciate everyone's time on this important issue. Just like Dr. Jarrod said, Dr. Shanahan said, racism has begun way past anything that we can imagine. It is systemic and has started as systemic racism. And today what we're seeing is frustration from years and years and years of oppression in the United States. And it was brought on like through coloniality into this country. And today we see such a profound incidence of racism only perpetrated by our former President Trump, who was in office. He almost, it's like he gave the nation permission to be racist, permission to go out and be abusive and discriminatory toward others. So we can see what has happened with the riots and everything else in the United States. And these incidences happen out of people being frustrated that there's no action taken against those perpetrators and the racist communities that are against the African American communities and the most indigent communities and people. So I can bring up statistics, I can talk about books I've read, I can do so many of those things, but the most profound experience I have is my 22 years in law enforcement and being in the most indigent neighborhoods, Fort Heights being one of them. I have been in Fort Heights majority of my career. And I know most of you don't know these areas, not being in our country, but I'm in Fort Heights, I'm in Robbins, I'm in Dixmoor, I'm in Chicago Heights. These are areas that are very, very depressed. Majority African American, Hispanic communities. And these are the communities I patrol. And these are the communities that I see the injustice that I'm speaking about today. I see white police officers pulling over African Americans. One African American man was petrified sitting in his car. I came up to assist two police officers who had their guns drawn on this African American man. And I said, what's happening? What's going on? And the young man had his window like rolled down about this much. Okay, the white officer said, well, he has a suspended license. I said, a suspended license? And you've got your guns drawn? I said, put your guns away. And I was able to speak to the young man and got him out of the car and just undid a situation that could have turned so ugly. Other situations where another white officer pulled out a family from their car in this pouring rain, and this young mother with her 3-month-old child sitting in the rain for what? He says, well, all I found was an empty bottle of a prescription bottle. I had put the family in my car because I just couldn't stand to see the incident that was happening. I can go on and on, everyone, about things that I have seen and I have experienced on a racist, discriminatory level that is uncalled for in our society. And then when I pull people over on a stop, it's the screaming and the yelling and the spitting at me. And I have to exercise an extreme amount of patience because I have to understand that the 100 people before me that are the same color as me have treated this person horribly. So why should they believe me? Why should they believe that I'm not like them? So it takes time to let the public know who I am. I'm in the Fort Heights community. I get out of my squad car. I speak with people. I don't talk at people. I talk with them. I speak with them. I engage with them. I ask them how they're doing. I have Mrs. McCullough on 15th Street, who's an elderly female who owns the funeral home in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson on DeForest Street, another elderly couple who need help, who need guidance. There's a young family on Diplomat Street. You get out and you engage with people. And I think that's what law enforcement has forgotten today, or they just don't do today, or their upbringing is such that they're in fear of the African-American community, of the Hispanic community, and they don't know how to talk to people. When we are social servants, we need to be able to speak to people and be able to engage with them in a manner that where we can say, okay, what's wrong? Why is your license suspended? What has happened to you? These things are not occurring today. So I just find that law enforcement has lost that connection with people. And I just am disheartened by the Asian community also, because I was up and working in Skokie also, and we had white Americans threatening the Asian community it was in an apartment complex, and they were threatening them and telling them to go back to their country, and all of these statements that Trump had started. And you could hear these statements being repeated by law enforcement and by people that just, it's just unbelievable, the things that are happening. So my injustice to my outlook towards all of this injustice is trying to educate, especially new officers, and trying to help those that are around me, mentor them. But it's hard because I'm one person. I cannot be in 100,000 different places. So through all of my experience and everything that I've come across, I just don't understand how the clock hasn't even gotten moved, not even 5 minutes from past history and past experiences. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement is the same thing that was the Black Panther movement back in the 60s. These are organizations created because of the injustice, because they feel that there's no other recourse that they have other than to break out and show their frustration. I get it. Are the riots wrong? Sure, they're wrong, but we have to address the real problem here, the real thing that's happening in our country, in our community. We have to address what's really happening in our society. Why is it that law enforcement and the majority of the white population cannot treat each other in a civil and in a just manner? So in conclusion to all of this, I just know that with my career and my voice in my department, I have gone through 22 years of law enforcement and have not been promoted. And I know it's because I have a certain voice and opinion about things, because when I see something wrong, I say that it's wrong. So maybe my department has not accommodated me, maybe they have not felt that I would be an asset to the white supremacists that are in place now, because I have a different voice. But I'm the type of an officer that if I see something wrong, I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell, because it's just plain and simple. It's not right, and it shouldn't be happening. But aside from all of that frustration that I have had with my career and disappointment, I know there is a higher power, and I know there is a journey that I am on now with being able to speak to globally, like we are here today, to let everybody know that we can all come together on this journey together and do something about the injustice that's happening to people today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miss Alexandra, on your sharing of some like very bothering experiences that you have while on duty. So I believe that us young generations here sure will have something to learn from your bravery and your courage to stand up for justice and what is right. So I believe that our audiences will have many questions for you later on in the Q&A sessions. So up next, we actually have Miss Chloe. Chloe is a third year economics and data science student at the University of Chicago. She is a half Singaporean and Chinese Indonesian, and she was raised in Shanghai. She's currently in the United States right now having her education, and having developed and grown her interest in international affairs and governance from Model United Nations and student government in high school, she has since continued to these interests in university. She's also a veteran member of the UChicago Model United Nations team, which thus exposed her to the traditionally white and male-dominated space of political science and public affairs in the US. She also explores the intersection of MUN with her academic studies, intending to head into a finance tech space in the future. So Chloe, welcome to have you here with us today. Would you like to start your statement now?
Yes, so thank you so much for having me. Honestly, I'm not too sure what I'm doing here after listening to an esteemed professor and police officer speak on the issue, but I think what I have to offer is something more of a modern student perspective, as this is something that I've experienced firsthand in different occasions as well as seen. So I'm kind of here to provide that student perspective from there. So just a little bit more about my background. I grew up in Shanghai, where racism, specifically anti-Asian racism, was just not a thing, because obviously. And being Singaporean, I did have that added advantage of being native English speaker as well as native in Chinese. So basically throughout my life, I didn't experience sexism or racism until I headed towards the United States for college. So that transition for me really didn't seem that big of a deal in my head. And I'll get into more of that if any of you are interested for Q&A. But I think what I have to offer is just some personal stories and some stories of my friends, right? So let's start from there. So if you didn't know, the University of Chicago is located on the south side of Chicago, which is just a more socioeconomically disadvantaged location, as well as a more marginalized group in regarding to like the city of Chicago. So we always say that like Northwestern's in the north and they're in Evanstown and they're like in a safe-ish neighborhood, and UChicago has the reputation of being in like the bad side of the neighborhood. So this is in part due to like a racist negative feedback loop psychology, because when we, and by we I mean international students, particularly Asians who are coming to UChicago, we were told by our parents and alumni not to go past 61st Street, so south of 61st Street, and not to go west of I think 45th or something like that. And the reason was because once you go past these neighborhoods, it becomes like 95% Black neighborhoods, right? And this is rooted in a kind of racist ideology that we were all subjected to. And I think very few of us has kind of come to realize that this is based in just like blatant discriminatory ideals. So for example, there are two instances that I would like to bring up. So one is my friend who is exactly my age. We went to the same high school. He was waiting at Garfield Station. So it's just like a normal metro station. He was just chilling there. He is Asian. He was wearing a backpack at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday night, trying to go downtown for his internship. And what ended up happening was a group of people, African-American males, came up to him and decided to steal his backpack with his laptop and everything. So he didn't let them, and he was subsequently punched and thrown to the side. Ultimately, he did decide to jump onto a train as it was coming by. So he was very luckily saved, and he did manage to salvage his laptop, but everything else was lost, right? So instances such as these were met in the overall university community with a sense of that's tragic, but that happens kind of attitude. But within the Asian community, it really created more fear, I think, towards a particular race, which I don't think is justified. And another incident is a shooting that occurred on campus recently, which is kind of terrifying if you think about it. It was in front of this, not a student dorm, but a very popular location right beside campus where students would live called Regents Park. This Asian PhD candidate was shot coming out of his apartment. So luckily he survived the incident. But again, this was another kind of one of those terrifying situations that kind of built up our fear towards the ultimate Atlantis shooting, right? So say his name, this killer was Robert Aaron Long. And the 6 Asian women that he killed kind of left a impact and sparked a lot of conversation on campus and just nationwide, right? And the questions I hear a lot and the topics I'm more interested in revolve those regarding the Asian community as well as the discrimination we face as being lesser than that of other races. And let's just talk about like the root of racism, I think, in this overall like panel, because we hear a lot of like Black Lives Matter, Asian Lives Matter, and then kind of in response to that, all lives matter, which is a whole thing, right? And I personally think that the situation where it's very intertwined between different races facing different types of discrimination, but still discrimination all the same, is just a very delicate and nuanced issue from the perspective of a student. So we hear these conversations on campus all the time, and it's very painful to understand that these people around me are the ones who are going to go into society and then kind of, you know, be the future and pillars of whatever society they end up staying in. So I guess that's what I have to offer. If anyone's interested in that, I'll ask some questions. And I think just in general, this past year for UChicago and for schools in general has changed a lot in the political scene. Like I was there for the George Floyd protests on campus, the non-violent student protests, as well as like the UCPD sit-ins, part of the Care Not Cops. And I think this situation right now, we are in a unique time where speaking out and movements online, social media, and in person have been at an unprecedented growth, and people are actually trying to learn about certain issues regarding racism. But it also has sparked a lot of it has brought to light a lot of very painful perceptions that we have to deal with regarding racism. So I think I'm kind of here for that. All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Chloe. It was really nice to hear your perspective as a young student in Chicago. And I mean, especially I think it's very relevant considering all of us are within that age group, and considering your ethnicity and how you changed from, let's say, a comfortable environment in Shanghai and then shifted to Chicago. How did that change your perspectives and whether your expectations met your reality as a student? So thanks for your sharing. So yeah, so now we're moving on to the dialogue session. So this is where all the participants, speakers as well, everyone's welcome to, okay, you could either use the emoji where you raise the hand. In Zoom, you'll be unmuted. You could voice out your questions to any of the speakers, or you could just add in your questions to the chat box and we'll pick it out and direct it to one of the speakers who could address your questions. So yeah, so we're moving to the Q&A section right now. So maybe one of the first questions, Jordan.
Hi, so for the first question, I would like to say that like what Ms. Alexandra has said earlier on, it is sometimes hard for certain people of color to actually believe that Ms. Alexandra was trying to help them because of their previous experiences with other police that has done terrible things to them. So something similar, but in another perspective, some people might say that most crimes are committed by Black people, and therefore justifying the disproportionate occurrences of police brutality towards this community due to implicit biases and unconscious stereotype by some policemen. So Ms. Alexandra and other speakers as well, what are your thoughts about this? Yeah. Maybe Ms. Alexandra can answer this question first. Would that be okay?
So the basis of the question was regarding crime in majority African-American communities. Is that what I'm getting from it?
Yeah, so there is this certain belief that they committed more crimes than other races. So what would you think, like, would that justify the fact that police are being more brutal to them?
Well, there's two things going on here. We have communities that are all majority African-American communities. Are there crimes committed? Of course there are. There are a lot of crimes. But what we're addressing is to differentiate the brutality part of that. And yes, we have aggressive situations. I have had personally people pointing a gun at me. These are situations that are very stressful. And I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of crime, but again, the mentality that is embedded in law enforcement and white populations from the time children are little, that they're taught on a moment-to-moment basis that African Americans are unintelligent, African Americans are criminals, African Americans are less than human, and this is part of our Constitution way back when, that they're 3/4 human. So when you're bombarded by such negativity, and then you become a law enforcement officer, and oh my goodness, now you have a badge and a gun. Oh, so now everything has escalated in your mind as far as what you think about the Black community. And these responses to brutality towards the Black community escalate to a level that I cannot even tell you what happens out there. But when you have a majority of people in a community like that, that are impoverished, that are discriminated against, that have suffered racism all their lives, you have a community that is high crime and is very dangerous. But majority of the time, it's not like that. You just have to handle each situation as you come across it. So these are ideologies, these are incidences that are put into people's minds. Like I said, I'm not saying that they're not true. There is crime in African American communities. There is crime in white communities. Is there more crime in African American communities? The statistics show yes, but it's how we handle these crimes and what we do as law enforcement officers dealing with the public. That's the issue for the majority of the crimes that are committed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Alexandra. I believe Prof. Shanahan has something to say. Would you like to share with us?
Sure, very quickly, to use the example of drug use, study after study proves that white people actually use more illegal drugs than African Americans, but African Americans account for a disproportionate amount of the arrests. So you have to be careful with the crime data. The crime data actually reflects the racial application of policing. Now, something that you can't do that with is violence, right? Interpersonal violence. It's very difficult to hide a dead body, so murder statistics are usually used to measure crime. But I think it's very important to understand that in neighborhoods like where Ms. Tan and I both live, apparently, Hyde Park in Chicago, the police response to drug use, I mean, the war on drugs in the United States, which has been going on for decades, and has wasted hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And the police response to gangs, which is to lock up the purported gang leaders, thus creating complete chaos in the social structures of the streets. The police response to drugs and gangs and other antisocial behavior has created incredibly disordered environments. By taking adult males off the streets, by producing an environment characterized by brutality and chaos. And so to whatever extent there is antisocial behavior in working class communities of color, the police have only made it worse.
Thank you for your sharing, Prof. Shanahan. Suraf, would you like to ask something?
Yeah, so we have another question. So this one, maybe Chloe, you could answer it. So in your experience, just now you were sharing about like personal anecdotes about how students face problems in Chicago, especially Asian American. So in your experience, do you feel that there have been changes, especially in the past 2 years, like considering how the pandemic could be could be a factor that played in the exacerbation of such racism towards Asian Americans. So do you think there are any differences from the past actions towards them to now? Is Chloe with us? Okay, all right.
I think, yeah. I think the pandemic, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. And I think the pandemic served as just a massive wake-up call and turning point for a lot of people. I think specifically what that means for anti-Asian hate is that it provided a sort of spark for people to speak out against. Like, it was as if they had something concrete to then lash out against this group that they had always been marginalizing, but probably not that extremely until something came about that you can then pinpoint them for, right? So this like anti-Asian hate kind of comes, like, in my opinion, kind of can be separated into two: one against just like Asian Americans and one against just like Asian internationals in general. I think the Asian international part is a little bit more nuanced, but if you're interested, there's an ICE policy, which, well, if you want to talk about ICE, is a whole other thing, but abolish ICE, where they attempted to deport international students right during the height of the pandemic. I'm not going to say this is racially motivated. It was probably just another Trump policy, but it was regarded as a marginalizing policy against a group of people, international students specifically, that is very integral to, I think, the American community. And then we have Asian Americans who honestly have no such correlation to the country they were originally from. Most of them are like second generation, third generation, sometimes even fourth generation Asian Americans who lived in the United States. And so I think what this shows that there is discrimination against all of these groups or both of these groups is that this racism really isn't like motivated by like nationality. It doesn't really matter. It really is about your skin color. And it really comes through to show that the pandemic served as a point for people to target those of a different skin color, specifically Asian, and kind of radicalize and escalate all of these past like thoughts and stereotypes people have had against Asian people, students, particularly from my experience, right? So like when I walk around Chicago wearing a mask, and keep in mind, this is probably February 2020. So COVID wasn't really like that big of a thing, or rather governments weren't really doing anything about COVID in the US. And I was yelled at and I was like throwing stuff at. And I think that kind of goes to show that one, people didn't really take the pandemic as a pandemic. It was more like a racially motivated conspiracy theory. Like, you wouldn't believe the conspiracy theories, I think, in Asia, the things that you circulate on the media here. Even now with the vaccines, people think it's like Bill Gates microchipping everybody, which is insane, kind of funny, but insane. And I think that all the stories you hear from Asian Americans and Asians talking about on social media, like the way they've been marginalized, like the different food that we've been eating since we were growing up, the names that we were called, being made fun of our appearance, both in like the makeup beauty world, as well as like the tech world, stereotypes of us being like smart, but yet submissive, hardworking, but yet very quiet, not joining unions because we're scared, right? All of these like fundamental things kind of allowed for that racism to be demonstrated over the years, but then also simultaneously delegitimized, because Asian Americans are not fundamentally a socio-economically disadvantaged like race, just like in general, right? Unlike, I think that's where it differs from African American communities. Asian Americans are not socially economically disadvantaged. And I think that kind of caused more of this like uninstitutionalized racism to occur, because it seemed like we were a powerful yet very quiet group. And the pandemic came and suddenly the tables turned. And I think that's kind of the entry point for a lot of this more outspoken hate that was always there.
Right. Thank you so much, Chloe, for your sharing. So yeah, right now we actually have a question from Mary. So Mary, maybe you would like to unmute and share your question. Wait, sorry, I think you'll have to be unmuted.
Yeah. Oh, hi, good evening. Am I audible already?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone from the speaker can answer this question. So when it comes to the pandemic, you know, there's a lot of racial profiling issues going around. So what does the U.S. law enforcement do when it comes to racial profiling? And is there any legal issues for it?
So, okay, considering your experience in law enforcement, maybe Miss Alexandra, you could share more into racial profiling and how does law enforcement react? What's the structure in place for such procedures?
there isn't a structure for racial profiling. Like I says, you have certain white officers, individuals who have this embedded racist mentality in them from the time they're young, and then they venture out into being law enforcement, and the African American communities are targeted without a doubt, because I can see a white officer, and I'm not talking about secondhand experience. I'm not talking about hearsay or third person telling me. I see these things of my own, on my own. And when they're pulling over a white American and they're talking and the position is relaxed and okay, you have a suspended license, so they give them the license back and go on your way. And then the whole atmosphere changes with an African American. So as far as racially profiling, absolutely, there is. And unfortunately, because I have the same skin color, they think I have the same mind color. I don't. And I disagree with the tactics and the reasons why they pull over certain people and the reasons why they don't pull over others. It's racially motivated. They'll deny it. Of course they will, because they would be charged with discrimination and racism. So they're gonna deny it. But when I see things and I see things wrong, like I says, I say something. And there was a particular officer that antagonized African Americans in Ford Heights. He was taken out of Ford Heights and put into a white neighborhood because the Ford Heights residents had a hit on him, meaning they were gonna kill him. This is how much damage he did to this community and to these people who did nothing to him. And I, again, witnessed it personally. So it's not that I can say that I heard it from somebody else. This happens. There is no system in place to stop it, because you cannot stop every individual and have them 30 or 40 years of upbringing change that in a flash of a light. It's just not going to happen.
Right, thank you so much, Miss Alexandra. So actually, yeah, right now we have another question that perhaps Professor Shanahan could answer, posed by another Professor, Renee from UIC. So I'm just going to unmute you, if you could just voice out your question yourself.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Hello, Professor Shanahan, Miss Alexandra and Miss Chloe, thank you. My question, I am very interested in knowing if there are intervention made by the local government of Chicago with on resolving the issue on racism and hate crimes, and then if there are intervention, is it effective? Like, I'm very, very interested to know what is the situation now in Chicago with regards to with regards to this issue, like racism and hate crimes. Thank you very much.
I don't know of any particular policies. Maybe Alexandra, you could take this if you know this. I will say that Chicago is spatially a very segregated city. In fact, I come from the Boston area, and it is perhaps the only place I've ever been to that's more segregated than that area. It's actually the racial animosity is very deliberately built into the city's structure, physical structure. During the rebellion last summer, the mayor raised the bridges in a very dramatic act to isolate the working class communities of color from the downtown area, which was identified as a higher value place in need of protection from the city's working class. And similarly, in the western part of the city, where Latino communities border African American communities, there was considerable racial violence, specifically against Latinos, against African Americans, carried out by Latinos. And this is a product of the way that the city was very deliberately built. And I just, it's reminiscent of the management of the railroad that I was talking about. I think you can learn a lot about the United States by how these big infrastructure projects were organized. And so unfortunately, it is no surprise that Chicago is an incredibly racist place. I mean, it would be a bigger surprise if people were able to overcome this very deliberate geographic and political separation that has been imposed on them. And I know that doesn't answer your question, but I hope it moves the needle just a tiny bit.
Renee, let me address that a little bit too. Thanks, Dr. Shanahan. Policies in place, sure, we have training that is online, and we're supposed to do the discrimination training and the racist training, and then, you know, you're going to get in trouble if you don't follow this and if you don't follow that. Again, that's all technical training. It's not mental training. It's not life training. It's not life experience. When you have an individual, like I've said, and I know I get so passionate about all this stuff if I'm running my mouth too much, but if you have individuals who are raised and taught these things all their life, in my opinion, I don't care how much training we have to click on the computer and answer the questions and you get 80% or 90% on the test. It doesn't matter, because what's instilled in a person when they are confronted with a stressful situation is fear. They have been taught to be afraid, just like Chloe said, to go across 63rd Street. Don't go south of 63rd Street. Don't go into Fort Heights. Don't go here. It's just embedded in them. And unfortunately, I wish there was more policy. I wish there was something that can be done to change the mindset of individuals, Renee. I just don't see it. There are a few of us that think like I do, that are my color. There's not a lot, but I hope in God's name that they come out and we can begin a journey together where we can start to eradicate what's happening in our country and against people of color. It's just crazy, and it's just uncalled for.
Thank you so much, Miss Alexandra, on your sharing about
Thank you, Ms.
how it's so
Alexandra.
hard to how it's so hard to get people to change their ways. So actually aligned to your how do you say, your occupation, we have an anonymous question actually. So what would be your thoughts on the whole sentiment of hashtag Blue Lives Matter? So maybe you could have some sharing, or this is open to the floor. So maybe after Ms. Alexandra talks, we could have a sharing from Professor Shanahan and Chloe as well.
Blue Lives Matter. Yeah, they do, because there are officers like myself out there who are trying to do what's right. There are African-American officers that we have all congregated together to try and stop this. Even they're facing discrimination against the Black community because they say, oh, you're one of them. For the Black officers, they're to another Black African-American in the community. Oh, you're siding with law enforcement? How could you become a police officer? So not only do they face discrimination when they take off their uniforms, they face discrimination also on the job. Because I interviewed about 23 people for my dissertation, and a lot of the African-American officers have said that when I take off my uniform, I'm just another African-American to society. It doesn't matter whether I have the uniform on. There was another lieutenant, I think it was about a month ago, he was in the military, and it was on the news, it was captured on camera. Thank God for cameras today. Otherwise, there would be so much more happening that the public doesn't know about. And I'm just so glad that we do have cameras, because it's showing a lot of the injustice that has been happening that years ago it was just hidden and covered up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Alexander. Actually, I just recall it was actually a viral video. I think the lieutenant was at the gas station or something, and yeah, and
right.
Yeah, it's really true. I believe that with everything's being displayed more, and now media is covering more because it's interesting to people, and yeah, essentially it's cause a lot more people to become aware of such occurrences. So yeah, so moving on, we have another question to Miss Chloe. So as your experience as a student, is there any action does your school take to combat the attacks on your campus or those studying at these campuses? So is there any policies in place that's been effective in your opinion?
It's a very nuanced question, and it's kind of hard for me to answer this because, okay, just to like set the playing field clear, right? Like UChicago campus itself, we have this blue light system when there's like a blue light at the edge of corner for like on campus. And if you are in any sort of like danger, you run to the blue light, you click it, and the UCPD will come to you, and pretty much the issue is resolved. There's very little crime that actually happens on campus. If you like define on campus as like the parameters in which we have our classes, it's more about the neighboring community. That's the bigger issue. So if you didn't know, UCPD is, I think, one of, if not the most, I think it's probably, okay, one of the largest privately funded police departments. And I want to put emphasis there on privately funded. So UCPD is UChicago, University of Chicago Police Department, right? But they don't just police the University of Chicago campus. They also police the neighboring regions. So like the campus plus a little bit more. And what's problematic about that is that because it's a privately owned police force, they don't really have an obligation to show their funding, which then results in a lack of accountability as to where that goes. And as I've mentioned, University of Chicago is located in the South Side, where the UCPD holds a considerable amount of power over people living in these communities, right? So that's a whole Care Not Cops movement that's started by UChicago students, which is demanding that the UCPD basically act as though they were a public police department and release their funds, or like release records of their funds and like where this is going and how are they managing themselves. That has yet to happen. And I don't know to what degree we can blame that on the university, but I will say that the fact that they didn't do that also shows something about it. The university hasn't really passed any policies on racism on campus. The most recent event that happened, which was not publicized, but now y'all know, which is that there are a lot of frats that have been continuing to meet despite COVID regulations on campus as well. And all that happened was that the people who were at the party and that frat has been suspended for I think like a week or so, not suspended from school, like suspended from having activities, and they were given verbal warnings, right? So nothing actually has happened, and frats and sororities are like one of the most like institutionalized perpetrators of racism on campus, right? They're like exclusive, like white, rich, sometimes Asian people, if you're like accepted into that club, if you're like, again, like part of them. And there's probably like one Black person I can think of in like any frat at any given time. And we're talking about like an 80 to 90 person organization on campus here. And there's like 6 or 7 of them, which is indicative of a racial problem, right? Now, there really isn't anything the university can do, because again, these are like university chapters on a national scale. But I think this like inability to take care of their own students because of all these institution and red tape also kind of speaks to how not just UChicago, but just universities in general, how very little power they have in regarding to other institutions on their campus, but also just the fact that their stance really isn't that clear. They're not doing anything proactive unless it's demanded of them by a movement. And that's just difficult given the pandemic and given the nature of school to ask people to rally and sit, which is why last summer there was a lot more movement. There was actually student protests on campus, which the university very nicely facilitated. I'll give them that, but nothing was actually done. So I'll say that it's a very weird space in which you're not doing anything, but you're also, it's just a lack of action that it's difficult to criticize, but also that we should, because we should demand more. That's it.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for your sharing. So yeah, actually, I think Professor Shanahan, you raised your hand, so maybe you have something to add to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on that very quickly and say that, Chloe, I'm really impressed with Care Not Cops. I've gone to a few of the actions at U of C, although for some reason people always think I'm a cop. And I am really impressed specifically with the fact that students at the U of C, right, as Chloe said, are besieged with all of this fear-mongering about their neighbors. The University of Chicago is a very affluent place. Hyde Park is a generally affluent place, and it borders working class communities of color, some of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. And students at the U of C are just positively inundated with stories of all of the terrible things that could happen to them if they stray south of 61st or whatever. And so I think it's very powerful for U of C students in particular to push back against this narrative and to push back against the idea that what they need is to align with the police against the working class Black people who live in what is effectively their neighborhood. And the word privilege gets thrown around a lot. I think privilege theory has been taken up by capitalism and neoliberalism to such an extent that it doesn't really mean anything anymore. But in its original context, when it was developed in the mid 20th century, the idea of challenging your privilege meant something very concrete. It meant refusing the structural role that pits you against working class Black people in particular, refusing to take the bait, refusing to side with the police and to side with the boss and to side with the white ruling class against Black people. And I think that the groups like Care Not Cops are a really powerful example of the best aspects of seriously engaging with privilege and challenging it.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Shannon, for your sharing. So yeah, I think we are going to take maybe another 2 more questions. So yeah, one question we had was, how does this could be an open question, anyone is welcome to answer it. So how does the US Police Department manage overcrowding of convicts, especially that we are in a pandemic? And are there any racist issues that is persistent on how suspects turn into convicts? Yeah, so maybe anyone could. The floor is open.
I'll answer that.
Yeah, I think the question has a lot to do with Miss Alexandra profession. So maybe you can
Yeah, the overcrowding in the jail system is something that they addressed early on when the pandemic began, and they separated them, because I'm just talking about Cook County Jail, which is the largest compound in the United States. They took them and separated them into another facility that was off-site, but still part of the jail system, which was a boot camp. So it had separate buildings, and they kept them quarantined there. They have quarantine tiers where the inmates are held also. So on intake, when somebody is arrested and they're charged and they're coming into the jail system, they will put them in a quarantined a cell or section, and the officers have to have a full uniform on with a mask and the gown and everything as they interact, because you still have to feed the people, they still have to get medicine. So Sheriff Dart, who is our sheriff in Cook County, he has arranged a very quarantined department where the spread of the COVID wasn't as drastic as it could have been, because it could have created an entire pandemic just in that jail system, because everything is under one compound. In the beginning, yes, it was hectic. It was crazy. I have a family member who works there. My daughter actually works in the jail, and other officers who are friends of mine that work in the jail, where we get firsthand information about what's going on in there. So the overcrowding now has been minimized. They have allowed a lot of people to bond out and go home. Majority of the elderly people who were there for minor crimes, theft, larceny, things like that were not serious convictions, like your higher crimes, your murders, your stabbings, your all those other criminalities that occur. So that's how he eliminated a lot of the overcrowding in the jail.
All right, thank you so much, Miss Alexandra. Due to time constraints, I think we are going to move on to the conclusion of this Zoom meeting. So first of all, before anything, I just really like to, I think I speak for everyone that we've gotten a lot more insight into the racial atmosphere in for African Americans, Asian Americans in America, and especially like to some extent we could relate to similar occurrences, maybe not to the same degree, but we could understand more. And I think that's a lot to we could have the media to thank for that, and especially like what Ms. Alexandra talked about, how now everyone's taking like photos and videos of occurrences, and it's becoming a lot more viral, and everyone's becoming more aware of these kind of occurrences. So I think in that extent, a lot more instances of racial events are being understood by more people across the world. So yeah, so just like to thank the speakers for that. I'll be handing over to Jordan, who will be concluding this session. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you, everyone. I'm actually here to promote SUSS Current Affairs Group. So please feel free to follow our social media platforms to receive more updates from us. We actually organize many events such as talks like this one, or maybe webinars, and as well as Model United Nations. So if you're interested to find out more, yeah, our handles are over here. Instagram is at currentaffairs.suss, and our LinkedIn is SUSS Current Affairs CAIG. Yep. So once again, I would like to say that it is our pleasure to have Ms. Alexandra, Professor Shanahan, and Ms. Chloe as our honored speakers today. So your sharing has given us so many insights, and also thanks everyone once again for joining us today. It is our pleasure to host this event, and if you have any questions for our speakers, do feel free to reach out to us, and we will relay your questions to the speaker at the time that is like good for both of us. Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you,
listeners'
everyone.
presence.
Thank you very much, SUSS. Thank you, Madam Alexandra. Thank you, Ms. Valerie.